The history of the Islamic Caliphates is often told in gold and glory, mighty empires, vast conquests, and cities shining under desert suns. But in the shadows of that triumph lies another story, a story not of rulers but of the conquered. Imagine waking to find your homeland no longer yours, your language silenced, your faith outlawed, your family torn apart. For many, conquest did not end with the battlefield. It began with chains, humiliation, and a life stripped of dignity. Victors wrote of honor, of expansion, of divine destiny. They did not write of the villages burned, the children taken, the men broken, or the women reduced to spoils of war. That truth was buried, smothered beneath centuries of silence. What does it mean to live under an empire that demands not only your obedience, but your very identity? What cruelties were inflicted upon those who could not escape the grip of the caliphates? This is not the history you were taught. This is the history they tried to erase, the cruelest things done to conquered peoples, and the voices that never lived to tell their tale. The city had changed overnight. Minarets now pierced the sky where once the spires of temples had stood. Streets that had once echoed with familiar prayers and laughter now trembled under the cadence of foreign boots. The air itself seemed heavier, thick with the scent of fear, smoke, and dust. Markets that once thrived on community and barter now obeyed new rules, rules written by conquerors who spoke a language unfamiliar and unforgiving. Among the conquered, the people moved cautiously. Faces that had known generations of familiarity were now etched with suspicion and anxiety. Conversations had become whispers. Laughter was rare. Children no longer played freely in the streets, their small hands clinging to mothers' robes, their eyes scanning every shadow for danger. In a small crumbling house at the edge of the city, a man named Idris stared at the horizon. Once he had tilled these lands, proud of the olive trees that had fed his family for decades. Now he wondered if his children would ever know the taste of freedom. The Caliphate soldiers patrolled endlessly, their eyes sharp, their presence a constant reminder that life had been irrevocably altered. Idris's mind drifted to the elders' stories of the city before conquest. Tales of festivals, of debates under the open sky, of faith practiced without fear. That world was gone, replaced by edicts, taxes, and an ever-present threat of punishment. Every step outside his door was a gamble. Every breath was a defiance, or perhaps an invitation to death. Across the city, whispers told of families torn apart, of men forced into labor, of women taken into quarters guarded by soldiers. The rumors were never fully confirmed, but the fear they bred was enough. One could not help but wonder, what horrors lay in wait for those who resisted? And what was left of the soul when survival demanded submission? Idris wandered through the alleys, his gaze falling on symbols of conquest etched on walls, the banners of the new rulers flapping ominously in the wind. Each one seemed to whisper the same warning: obey or suffer. Mothers clutched their children tighter, merchants counted coins with trembling hands, and the once proud streets had become corridors of dread. The first taste of the new world had been subtle: taxes, new laws, restrictions on speech and dress. But it did not take long for whispers to turn into screams. Stories spread of villages that resisted, of men and women punished not only for defiance, but for being born under the wrong sky, for praying in the wrong way, for singing old songs that had been safe for centuries. The rules of survival were cruel and exacting, and even the smallest misstep could bring unimaginable consequences. Idris thought of his family. His daughters, now older, moved silently through the house, eyes wide with the knowledge that innocence could be a liability. His sons had begun to question the world around them, to ask questions that might attract attention. The fear of being overheard was constant, yet impossible to ignore. What kind of life was this, when every thought, every glance, every breath was a risk? As the sun set, the city's shadows lengthened, swallowing streets and alleyways alike. Lamps were lit, casting trembling circles of light on the cracked stone. Idris knew that night brought no rest. The conqueror's soldiers could appear at any moment. Stories of raids, kidnappings, and public punishments circulated like wildfire, leaving a residue of terror that clung to everyone. And yet, even in the midst of oppression, small acts of resistance flickered. A hidden prayer, a smuggled scroll, a whispered plan for tomorrow. These moments were dangerous, but they were also proof that hope, however faint, still endured. Idris understood that survival demanded both caution and courage, and that the coming days would test the limits of both. The city slept fitfully under the shadow of conquest, and Idris felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. The world he had known was gone, replaced by something far darker, and as the night deepened, so too did the realization that life under the Caliphate was not just about obedience. It was about enduring the unimaginable, about witnessing cruelty that had no mercy, and about finding a spark of humanity in a place designed to extinguish it. The following days brought no relief. Idris awoke to the distant clang of bells and the shouted orders of soldiers patrolling streets that had once been alive with the chatter of neighbors. Every corner of the city now bore the weight of conquest, walls scarred with symbols of dominance, marketplaces regulated with strict codes, and homes shadowed by the presence of enforcers who seemed to materialize from nowhere. Families whispered in secret chambers, sharing news of punishments that had befallen neighbors. A man had been taken for questioning, never to return. A woman had vanished after defying a curfew, her screams rumored to echo through the alleys late at night. Each story was worse than the last, each word steeped in fear yet impossible to ignore. Idris felt the pressure of survival every time he walked through the streets. Soldiers scrutinized his every movement. Merchants eyed his coins as though they could determine guilt by the way he handled them. Even children sensed the tension, their small bodies stiff with fear, their eyes scanning every shadow. The city had become a cage, invisible bars pressing down on the soul. The new laws were suffocating. Public gatherings were forbidden, prayers had to follow the conqueror's customs, and old languages were spoken only in whispers, as if words themselves could betray a family's heritage. Taxes drained what little wealth remained, leaving families dependent on the mercy of officials whose interpretations of justice were cruel and unpredictable. Idris witnessed subtle acts of tyranny firsthand. A neighbor, caught reciting forbidden verses, was publicly humiliated, his head shaved and tongue branded with a warning. Mothers were forbidden to sing lullabies in their old tongue, lest the words carry the infection of rebellion to their children. Even a glance at a past enemy, once a friend, could be interpreted as subversive. Fear had seeped into every interaction, yet amid this oppression, small acts of humanity persisted. Idris's wife Layla secretly taught their daughters the old songs, weaving them between new prayers. Idris risked smuggling scrolls from hidden libraries, carrying fragments of their culture that might otherwise have been lost forever. These acts were small, fragile defiance, yet each carried a weight that could crush the unwary. One night, whispers reached Idris of a nearby village that had resisted. The Caliphate's soldiers had descended upon it, and when they departed, the village was unrecognizable. Homes burned, families scattered, men and women forced into servitude. The tale spread quickly, a grim testament to the consequences of defiance. Idris shivered, the story echoing like a drumbeat in his mind. Resistance was not merely punished, it was annihilated. The children sensed it too. Their questions, once innocent, had grown dangerous. "Father, why can't we play in the square? Why must we speak quietly? Why does the sky feel different?" Idris had no answers that would satisfy them without risking their safety. Survival demanded silence, yet silence felt like complicity in a system designed to strip the conquered of dignity. The city itself seemed alive with tension. The shadows of soldiers stretched long across the streets as the sun fell, and the wind carried distant cries from corners Idris dared not approach. Every step outside the safety of his home was calculated, every conversation measured, every glance held meaning. A world that had once been predictable and familiar had transformed into a labyrinth of terror. Idris's own soul began to fracture under the weight of this reality. He saw men he had grown up with reduced to shadows of themselves, women who once danced in festivals, now clutching their children in terror, and children who had never known freedom. The conquest had not ended. It had only begun to show its true face. And then came the rumors of the cruelest acts, the things whispered about in hushed tones behind closed doors. Families taken from their homes in the dead of night. Boys and girls sold into service far from their lands. Men forced to labor until their bodies broke. Women stripped of all autonomy, made to serve those who claimed victory as their divine right. No one was immune and no one was safe. Idris realized that life under the Caliphate demanded a choice that no man should ever have to make: submit entirely or risk annihilation. And yet the fire of resistance still flickered in the hearts of those who had not yet been broken. Even in despair, hope persisted, fragile and dangerous, a light that could either guide or destroy. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, trembling shadows across the city, Idris understood the truth of his existence. The world he had known was gone. In its place stood a kingdom of fear, cruelty, and oppression. The coming days would reveal the full measure of the Caliphate's cruelty, and the true horrors of conquest would no longer be whispers. They would be lived, endured, and survived. The first signs of the true cruelty began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Soldiers no longer just patrolled the streets. They watched the windows, the doorways, the very gaze of the people. Each glance became a test, each footstep a possible accusation. Idris felt the weight of every eye upon him as he walked through the marketplace, where merchants had begun hiding goods and conversations. Even a whispered disagreement could summon the wrath of the conquerors. One morning, a family on the corner of the street vanished. No one dared to ask why, but rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the father had spoken against the new laws. Others claimed the children had been caught practicing an old ritual. Idris did not know which was true. It did not matter. The fear alone was enough. Mothers pulled their children inside. Men lowered their heads, and silence enveloped the streets like a suffocating fog. Idris's own household felt the tightening grip of oppression. Soldiers demanded higher taxes, claiming it was for the protection of the empire, yet their presence only brought terror. Neighbors whispered of confiscated homes and forced labor. Every day Idris watched men he had grown up with transformed into shadows, broken in body, spirit, or both. The reality of survival demanded compromise, but even that could not shield them from the unpredictable cruelty of power. Rumors reached Idris of the conqueror's secret prisons, dungeons hidden beneath the city, where the punished were sent without trial. Mothers wept silently for sons who never returned, and fathers stared at empty doorways, their hearts heavy with uncertainty. Idris imagined the cries echoing through stone corridors, a sound designed to break even the strongest will. The city's culture began to vanish under the Caliphate's rule. Ancient songs were forbidden, sacred texts hidden or destroyed, and public festivals replaced with proclamations of dominance. Even the markets, once lively and vibrant, became lifeless avenues where trade existed only under strict supervision. Children were forbidden to play, and the streets that had once been filled with laughter became corridors of tension and despair. Idris's daughters began to understand fear in ways they had never known. Their laughter disappeared, replaced with quiet obedience. Their questions, once innocent, were now whispered anxiously. Even the smallest act of joy felt dangerous. Each day Idris felt the crushing weight of responsibility, not just to protect his family, but to preserve what remained of their humanity. One evening, soldiers stormed a neighboring street. A man had dared to speak in his native tongue. The punishment was swift and merciless: public humiliation, shackles, and forced labor. Idris watched from a distance, heart pounding as the man's life was transformed in moments. The lesson was clear: obedience was not enough. Fear had to be absolute. The whispers of cruelty became stories, and stories became warnings. Villages that resisted were razed. Men were beaten, women taken, and children sold into service far from home. No corner of the conquered lands was untouched. Idris felt the gnawing realization that the horrors were not isolated, they were systematic. Every law, every decree, every patrol was a thread in a vast web of control, designed to crush resistance and erase identity. Amid the despair, flickers of defiance persisted. Secret meetings, hidden scrolls, clandestine teachings, all acts of resistance were fraught with danger. Idris knew that any misstep could bring annihilation, yet the human spirit is not so easily extinguished. Even in the heart of oppression, courage and hope endured, fragile but unyielding. By the end of these weeks, Idris's world had transformed completely. The streets he had once walked freely now felt like a cage. The faces he knew were now masks of fear. And in the shadows, the full measure of the Caliphate's cruelty was waiting, ready to descend upon those who dared even a fleeting thought of freedom. The stage was set. The world Idris knew no longer existed, and the horrors to come would test the limits of survival, morality, and the human spirit itself. The days grew darker, not because of the sun, but because the city itself seemed to suffocate under the weight of conquest. Soldiers no longer merely patrolled, they commanded. They entered homes without warning, demanded loyalty without question, and punished those who dared to hesitate. Even the walls of Idris's house, once a sanctuary, felt like a cage. One morning, a neighbor's home was ransacked. Soldiers dragged men and women into the streets, shouting accusations no one could understand. The children cried, but the cries were silenced quickly, harshly, by the crack of a whip. Idris watched helplessly from behind his shuttered window, knowing that even intervention could mean death. That day, the reality of conquest revealed its full teeth, power wielded without mercy, law, or conscience. Idris's family began to feel the personal sting of oppression. His eldest son, Omar, had been caught speaking a forbidden word. The soldiers took him for instruction, leaving Idris to tremble as he imagined the horrors awaiting his boy. When Omar returned, he was silent, withdrawn, his spirit fractured by the experience. Idris saw in him the first signs of a generation marked by fear, molded to obedience by cruelty. The streets themselves became instruments of terror. Public punishments were no longer just examples. They were spectacles meant to imprint fear into every observer. A man was whipped for failing to pay an inflated tax. A woman's head was shaved for wearing traditional clothing. Children witnessed these acts, learning that innocence and life were fragile as glass under a hammer. Idris attempted to resist quietly. He whispered prayers in secret, preserved fragments of the old culture, and helped neighbors hide forbidden items. But the conqueror's reach was vast. Rumors spread of hidden spies and informants in every street. Every act of defiance was a risk, and every risk carried consequences that could destroy entire families. As the weeks turned to months, the cruelty became more targeted, more intimate. Families were separated. Men were forced to labor far from their homes. Women were taken for service, their autonomy erased in a single night. Children were sold or conscripted, taught to obey before they could understand freedom. Idris's home became a fortress of vigilance, yet even vigilance could not erase the anxiety that gnawed at every heart. The psychological toll was immense. Fear became a constant companion. Trust was a luxury none could afford. The people whispered of secret prisons, of disappearances, of torture carried out under the guise of law. Each tale, whether true or exaggerated, left a residue of terror. Every corner of the city bore witness to oppression, and even those who survived bore scars invisible to the eye. Idris watched the transformation of his city with a growing sense of dread. Friends became strangers, allies vanished, communities fractured under the pressure of survival. And yet amid this darkness, glimmers of resistance persisted. Hidden scrolls, secret lessons, forbidden prayers, all carried on in defiance of the conqueror's attempt to erase identity. These acts, though dangerous, were the heartbeat of hope in a world designed to crush it. One night, whispers of a faraway village that had resisted fully reached the city. Soldiers had descended upon it without warning. The survivors' stories, pieced together by travelers, spoke of devastation. Homes leveled, men enslaved, women taken, children scattered. The message was chillingly clear. The Caliphate tolerated no defiance, no exceptions, no mercy. Idris felt the tension building within his own home. His family huddled in the quiet, their movements cautious, their words measured. The children no longer played, no longer laughed. Even the smallest spark of joy could attract danger. The weight of oppression pressed on them, shaping their lives, their decisions, their very thoughts. By now, the city had become a labyrinth of fear. Streets that were once familiar were now treacherous. Every glance, every step, every word could be interpreted as rebellion. And in the shadows, the full force of the conqueror's cruelty was waiting, poised to strike with precision and without remorse. Idris understood that the horrors he had only glimpsed in whispers were about to unfold in full. The system of fear was not random. It was deliberate, meticulous, and unstoppable. And when the moment came, it would test not only survival but morality, courage, and the very essence of what it meant to be human under oppression. The stage was set. The tension had reached its peak. And soon, the full measure of the Caliphate's cruelty would descend, leaving no life untouched and no soul unscarred. The sun rose like a pale eye over the conquered city, casting long shadows that seemed to tremble with the weight of dread. Idris felt the tension coiling in his chest, as if the air itself were alive, anticipating what was to come. Rumors had spread through the city like wildfire. A final, sweeping operation was to purge all remaining pockets of resistance. Those who had survived, hidden or even whispered in defiance, would be made to pay the full price of survival. The streets were unnervingly quiet. Shops shuttered, families barricaded inside their homes. Even the wind seemed hesitant, carrying only the distant echoes of soldiers marching in formation. Idris knew this day would come, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of it. His heart hammered as he gripped the wooden beams of his home, praying that his family would somehow endure the storm. It began without warning. Soldiers burst into the alleys, shouting commands that reverberated like thunder. Idris's neighbors were dragged into the streets, screams puncturing the morning air. Women clutched their children. Men raised empty hands in futile protest. The conquerors moved with calculated precision, their actions systematic, merciless, and absolute. Idris's home was next. The door was smashed open, splintering wood flying as soldiers stormed in. He shielded his family instinctively, holding his daughters close and urging Omar to remain silent. But silence offered no protection. The soldiers seized Idris and dragged him into the street, leaving his wife and children trembling in the doorway. The air was thick with fear, smoke, and the scent of burning belongings from nearby homes. The conqueror's cruelty revealed itself fully. Men were bound and forced to march barefoot through streets slick with blood and debris. Women were separated, their cries echoing through stone corridors as they were dragged away into unknown captivity. Children were torn from their parents, their small hands held by strangers who showed no mercy. Idris could barely breathe as he watched, powerless as the world he had known dissolved into chaos. In the public square, the punishment was merciless and theatrical. Those who had resisted, even subtly, were displayed as warnings. Shackled, beaten, and humiliated, they became living testaments to the conqueror's absolute authority. Idris saw men he had known all his life reduced to shadows, women stripped of dignity, and children witnessing horrors no words could capture. Every act of cruelty was precise, intentional, and designed to break the spirit completely. Yet even amid the horror, moments of defiance persisted. Idris caught a glimpse of a man whispering words of comfort to a bound companion, a small spark of resistance flickering in the face of overwhelming force. Layla, his wife, whispered prayers to the heavens as she clutched their daughters, refusing to let despair completely consume her. These fragile acts of humanity were fleeting, yet they shone like embers in the darkness, proof that the human spirit, though battered, could endure. The full scale of the conquest's cruelty became apparent as the day wore on. Families were torn apart, homes burned, sacred places desecrated. The conquerors moved with efficiency, leaving nothing to chance. Fear became a living entity, wrapping itself around every heart in the city. Idris felt the weight of helplessness pressing down upon him, yet he refused to surrender entirely. Every instinct screamed survival, yet the agony of witnessing the suffering of his people threatened to consume him. Night fell, and the city was a landscape of shadows and devastation. Survivors huddled in broken homes, trembling in the aftermath of the day's horrors. Idris's family was battered but alive. His children, eyes wide with terror, clung to him and Layla. The full measure of cruelty had been delivered, yet amid the ruins, they had endured. Survival was no victory. It was a testament to resilience, hope, and the quiet defiance that could not be extinguished by brute force alone. And as Idris gazed upon the ruined streets, he understood a terrible truth. Oppression was designed to erase identity, crush courage, and silence hope. Yet the human spirit, even under unimaginable cruelty, had a capacity to endure, resist, and bear witness. The horrors had been revealed, the climax reached, and the story of suffering and endurance had etched itself indelibly into the memory of those who survived. The city slept fitfully under the shadow of conquest, yet within its walls, hearts still beat with quiet courage, whispering that even in the darkest of times, humanity could endure. The city woke to a fragile dawn. Smoke still lingered over the streets, carrying with it the scent of burned homes, scorched earth, and lives forever altered. Idris stepped carefully over the debris, guiding his children through streets that had once been alive with laughter, but were now eerily silent. Each step was a reminder of what had been lost, yet also of what endured. In the aftermath of conquest, survival was not a celebration. It was a quiet, persistent act of defiance. Families huddled together, preserving the fragments of culture, faith, and memory that the conquerors had sought to erase. Every whispered prayer, every hidden song, every stolen moment of joy became a form of resistance, proof that the human spirit could withstand even the most calculated cruelty. Idris reflected on the lives shattered by oppression. Men forced into labor, women taken into captivity, children robbed of innocence. The toll was immense. Yet he also saw resilience. Layla, his wife, tended to the wounded and frightened children, her hands gentle but firm, teaching them courage and perseverance. Omar, his eldest son, had found a quiet strength, carrying his trauma with dignity, ready to protect the family that depended on him. The city itself bore the scars of conquest. Temples had been destroyed, homes razed, and streets that had thrived now lay in ruin. Yet even amid devastation, life persisted. Markets reopened in small ways. Hidden libraries preserved scraps of forbidden texts, and neighbors offered silent gestures of solidarity to one another. The conqueror's control was powerful, but it could not extinguish hope entirely. History often remembers the victors, the generals, the rulers, the empires that expanded their borders. But it rarely remembers the victims, the lives caught in the machinery of power, the ordinary people who endured unimaginable cruelty. Idris knew that survival was not merely living, it was bearing witness. It was ensuring that the stories of suffering, courage, and defiance would not vanish with the passing of time. The lessons of oppression were clear. Absolute power wielded without justice could destroy lives, erase identities, and impose fear as a tool of control. Yet even in the darkest chapters, the human capacity for resilience, compassion, and courage endured. Survival itself became an act of defiance, and the small sparks of resistance ignited hope that one day the cycle of cruelty could be broken. Idris and his family had endured the worst. They had seen the full measure of cruelty, the depth of human suffering, and the systematic oppression designed to crush spirit and identity. And yet they had survived. Not unscathed, not unbroken, but alive, holding on to fragments of their past, and with them the potential for a future where memory, culture, and humanity could endure. As the sun set on the ruined city, Idris looked at his children, seeing in their eyes both the fear of what had been and the possibility of what could come. The conquerors may have sought to erase them, to strip them of identity, and to impose fear as a tool of control, but they had not succeeded completely. The human spirit, though battered, remained unbowed. And so the story ends not in triumph, but in reflection. History will remember the empires, the victories, and the cruelty, but it is in the stories of those who survived, those who resisted in small ways, and those who bore witness, that the true legacy lies. What does it mean to endure oppression? To survive when cruelty surrounds you? To witness injustice without being able to stop it? Idris's story is one of countless untold lives, a reminder that even in the darkest times humanity can endure, and that bearing witness is itself a powerful act of defiance. In the silence that follows, one question remains: how many stories of suffering and courage have been lost to history, and what can we learn from the ones that remain?